Warning beforehand, this video will lightly address themes of sexual assault, police corruption, and brutality and racism. Nothing too explicit in my opinion. If you've seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine, it'll all be stuff you've seen before. But obviously, the extremity of the content is not up for me to judge, so proceed with caution. Also, this is going to be more about the issues raised in this season, and I'll tackle the actual final episode maybe in a separate thing. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a modern television masterpiece that I remember being a pretty small show I accidentally stumbled on in its first season that got me interested because I love Lonely Island, and then went on to become a massive television juggernaut rivaling the likes of Friends and The Office, consequently leading to the show being referenced everywhere and playing a key part in like 40% of Tinder bios. Outside of its mainstream appeal and progressive way of writing characters and dialogue, it also shows us that there is immense storytelling and entertainment potential in anything if the right people are involved. On the surface as a concept, a comedy about cops feels dated and overdone, as it isn't as niche a job or even show structure to really hold up in the modern day, but it somehow works.
Andy Samberg. Looking forward to your new show, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Funny cops. You're always pushing the envelope, Andy.
And the show definitely works because of the talent behind it. On the writing producing side, you have comedy legends, veterans, and all-around fun pair of names to say, Dan Gore and Michael Schur, who've tackled the modern workplace comedy to great success with their respective experiences on shows like The Office and Parks and Recreation. And while these shows did have seriousness mixed in with the comedy, it wasn't their cross to bear. Writing a show about cops with the idea of making them likable not only invites criticism, which wouldn't be present even in Parks and Rec, given the show's small-town, low-level government angle distancing it from the larger qualms people have with the government, but it also puts itself in a position where, unless it's going completely ludicrous like say Police Squad, it needs to be able to tackle serious issues to stay afloat as a concept. And presenting a lot of those issues puts the show in a position where they have to excuse the behavior to uphold the idea that the system your favorite characters operate in isn't flawed. Unless of course they go the path of something like Veep or really anything Armando Iannucci has made and take a cynical approach where you're not supposed to like the characters. And then they cast Andy Samberg as the lead, the man known at the time for comedy songs and over-the-top stoner humor acting. And it seemed like they wouldn't be able to tackle those serious topics.
What's gonna happen when you run out of funny crimes like graffiti and pickpockets? Can't wait to see episode 10 when Brooklyn Nine-Nine has to deal with a rape. Oh, I dropped the rape kit, schmorgy-dorg.
5 minutes later.
Yeah, good news for all you murder fans.
Meanwhile, as his co-star was Andre Braugher, a man who was known for much more serious roles, playing both captains and cops in serious shows.
And Darkseid, Dark Automotive Apocalypse.
Obviously. Samberg had dipped his toe in the dramatic with Celeste and Jesse Forever, and Braugher had done Men of a Certain Age, but the expectation going in was always going to be that of a Leslie Nielsen-esque straight man up against a wackier Looney Tunes individual. But it was a runaway success because these two, and the entire cast around them, some of which had also come from disparate backgrounds of just the goofier elements of comedy or straight drama, could bring both in equal spades in surprising new ways. Throughout some hilarious seasons where we still like all the characters, the show never forgot to remind us of real-life injustice caused by the more negative aspects of policing. Hell, Rose's introduction brings the topic of police brutality up immediately.
Don't arrest him. Just smack him. Hard. With a phone book on a body part no one can see, you know what I'm saying?
So you're suggesting police brutality?
I guess so, yeah. Why?
It doesn't hide from or wash away these issues, and Captain Holt is a necessary piece of the puzzle, using his identity as a gay black man and his experience as a cop to give us a look into policing in the past and how or whether or not it's changed. The show has never shied away from difficult topics or serious social issues, taking on issues that are incredibly relevant like sexism in the workplace, the self-destructive red tape surrounding the police force, sexual assault, profiling, gun control, the dangers of being in the police, transphobia and other issues in the prison system, policing practices like stop and frisk, homophobia, police corruption, and even direct references to real-life incidents like the arrest of 14-year-old Ahmed Mohammed.
Turns out there wasn't a bomb, it was a clock made by an overachieving minority student. What a world we live in.
And while a lot of these were one-off mentions or special episodes, it wasn't until this final season that Brooklyn Nine-Nine started to make points that stuck through the whole season. Due to multiple factors, this season was put off for just under a year, and it's weird to think that had COVID not happened, the season might have come out mid-George Floyd protests, and the show would go out on a perceived as tone-deaf whimper. And the show used this time to rewrite episodes to fit the climate, apparently abandoning 4 planned episodes. Whether it was creatively intentional or not, given how much the schedule had to move around, this final season aired weekly with back-to-back episodes, and this allowed for an incredibly creative way to toe the line of ending a highly rated comedy on a bang, but also being able to deal with serious issues without feeling like the tone was whiplashing week by week. especially considering the show's popularity and status as arguably one of the prime gift manufacturers of the 2010s, had made its final season one that almost needed self-reference and returning characters and jokes to be able to live up to expectations. Every week outside of the final week had one episode tackling the issue of police reform and was a response to the 2020 protests, and one episode that was a classic Brooklyn Nine-Nine romp. 2020 had a lot of important events surrounding it, and while shows like Superstore went all in on the strain of COVID while lightly touching on the BLM protests, Brooklyn Nine-Nine only lightly touched on COVID with a cold open and one line, and instead decided to focus on issues that have plagued the police for decades and were incredibly prevalent at the time, which definitely was what was needed for both shows, given their settings. To show this division of episodes, they decided to put in the character of Frank O'Sullivan in every issue tackling episode as an anchor point, as well as tying those episodes together through a thread of Holt and Amy creating a police reform bill. A lot of the show's antagonists are also extensions of the idea that while police are necessary in dealing with crime, a lot of the bigger threats to them come from within their departments, outside of minor one-episode antagonists like inefficient, backwards-thinking Sheriff Reynolds, Jimmy Brogan, who romanticizes the days when police brutality was more acceptable and took priority over efficiently dealing with crimes, or corrupt cop Stevie Shillings. We have Keith Pembroke, a sexually harassing example of ego-driven, corrupt police work by those who put the insecure feeling of being a hero above ethical police work.
See that guy behind you? That sniper? He'll shoot whoever I tell him to. Even you. I want you to dump Santiago, and that's an order.
Jimmy Figgis, a crime boss, an example of how easily crime and corruption can seep into the system with a mole in the FBI. Bob Anderson, said mole, who is an example of how police become corrupt through disillusion. Madeline Wunsch, an example of high-level members of the police force who have the ability to enact change and instead choose to put their beliefs and self-interest above the well-being and safety of the community. Jason Stanley, more of an antagonist than a villain, his character represents the entire idea of incompetent, self-involved cops stumbling up the ladder and then running the police into the ground. Jeffrey Hoitzman, an interesting deviation from the antagonist norm by exploring other people connected to the police who wallow in their excessive wealth and power and also live without consequence. Veronica Hopkins, a cop that lets her personal feelings affect her job. Debbie Fogel, an incompetent cop who is swayed into corruption and is related to Jared Fogle. The Podolskis, examples of high-level corruption through nepotism, blackmail, and possibly even collusion with the criminal elite in Lucas Wind. John Kelly, a corrupt commissioner looking to bring back police policies that enabled racism. And Melanie Hawkins, a corrupt cop who will make a mockery of the justice system and get away with it to suit her own agenda, and like Stevie Shillings before her, will frame people in pursuit of that goal. You could also argue Seamus Murphy had some sway in the police department, although given that sway happens to be with characters like Amy and Holt, the corruption doesn't set in stone in the story despite his initial compromising of Holt. Although even if you did count him, I searched high and low and the only other antagonist of note is the Pontiac Bandit, who arguably isn't a villain at all. The Nutriboom Company, and I guess maybe Boyle's ex-wife? Although she only has one episode, and that episode is about how she's trying to blackmail Boyle into being corrupt to get charges against her dropped, and it nearly worked, so I guess we'll have to counter. I was going to take the time here to talk about how ACABers will blindly brand the show as propaganda, being clouded by their opinion over the reality of what the show presents, instead of laying criticism at places where it's deserved. But that issue is much more difficult and nuanced, and the script is already looking massive, so I might tackle that some other time. Although I've just got to say, Skip Intro, you did a fantastic job despite any disagreements I have, and it was definitely a mature and interesting take that raises some incredibly strong points among a sea of underdeveloped, bias-informed takes from others. You should go check him out if you haven't already. This leads into the major antagonist of the final season, Frank O'Sullivan, played perfectly by a phenomenal talent. This role amidst the current social climate was a genius move. Not only was John C. McGinley perfect, while with his acting background playing every shade of a no-nonsense to the point of pushing problematic man in charge in both drama and comedy, but the role itself perfectly punctuates the episode and is a masterclass on how a final season of a show like this in the current landscape should be done. Frank O'Sullivan is such a perfect character because of what he represents. He isn't outwardly racist or sexist, for the most part.
It's because I don't look at women's eyes when I'm talking to them. Now what's going on?
And he believes that getting cops off without consequence is a noble job, and he hits all the talking points of someone who you could imagine would actually be in charge of a patrolman's union without descending too much into farcical territory that could have maybe suggested him to be more of a character than a real person. He's even got a somewhat fleshed out character, with us knowing he lives with his mother, who we also get to know, and that they have a mutual love of Billy Joel. This guy is the perfect sort of person to be an antagonist because he's just a guy. He's no Melanie Hawkins where he's a straight up criminal, and he's no Vulture who antagonizes for the sake of antagonizing. He's a guy who thinks he's good, but is too ingrained and comfortable in the toxic elements of the system to see he's part of the problem and bringing down the police. An organization that largely operates on a perceived sense of trust from the community. Hell, even his threats aren't to the level of, say, Seamus Murphy, and are more akin to the pranks the different departments played on each other in the earlier seasons. So with that meandering setup done, let's go through these weeks. Week 1.
We're not gonna abuse our power.
Of course not. We're good cops. I was just exaggerating. Rosa, I was not exaggerating.
Great.
Week 1 provided us with a classic Brooklyn Nine-Nine romp in the vein of episodes like Beach House, as we see Rosa getting high and Holt dealing with his deteriorating relationship. But in terms of its serious episode, this episode follows suit with such special episodes as Moo Moo and He Said She Said. Those episodes made their point here by having the issues of racism and sexual assault affect main characters Terry and Amy, with Holt and Rosa having a secondary role in presenting these issues. With this episode, however, the issues they address affect those outside of the police, and so the writers had to find a way to make them affect a character and instead focus on the reaction to the issues, affecting Rosa this time by having her quit the force and focusing on the loss of what was already dwindling trust in the police, with Charles taking a secondary role in exploring these ideas by handling the role of people performatively infantilizing minorities out of a misplaced sense of goodwill and sympathy. On a personal note, this was definitely the most uncomfortable of Boyle's moments in the show. As being a brand guy who always dealt with people in corporate policies and initiatives that do this, it was a bit uncomfortable for me seeing a member of the normally pretty socially conscious 9-9 cops, Hitchcock not included, completely lack social awareness to this level. But from a writing standpoint, it was a really strong choice to push him there and not necessarily have him change by the end, which is indicative of a real true issue and one that extends outside the confines of criticism of the police specifically. While exploring this dynamic on the side, the episode's main focus is that of Rosa and Jake. In seasons before, we've seen how people have very little respect for the police, but in the wake of the George Floyd protests, we see how trust has reached an all-time low, as the regular plot motivation of Brooklyn Nine-Nine and hundreds of other cop shows, which comes in the form of canvassing, is now not an option due to public mistrust in the cops. The plot revolves around an all too familiar in America case, in Rosa's new job as a PI specializing in police brutality cases, that Jake wants to assist with, the motives of which are questioned. This question and the tension surrounding it are definitely the strongest parts of the episode, having Jake trying to make the point that there may be bad cops, but the system can still work if good cops keep trying, a point that turns on him and hits like a stack of bricks when he sees someone he trusts as one of the good ones helplessly bend to the system that lets these officers get away with crimes. And honestly, as bad as she's seen as being, she really acts as if she's tried this before and would love to help, but she understands the process won't help her. She's given up on trying despite initially providing help, and this antagonistic angle she's created helps Jake grow, especially when he hears from her a sentiment which he genuinely expresses about himself being one of the good ones earlier that horrifyingly is mirrored back to him. That said, her heel turn after all her help makes it seem like her earlier stating of the officers' crimes is just flexing on them the open secret of how bad it is, but nothing of note happens in terms of consequences. Rosa theorizes that the officers harassed her client because of the time of day and were looking for overtime pay, which is pretty heavily connected to real-life police doing this and purposely making arrests to inflate numbers. In fact, we see this toxic element play out in the first season with Amy and Jake's bet to see how many people they can arrest. Although that was very cleverly written in a way in which where we see none of the arrests were haphazard or sloppy and all well within the ethics of the law, and we really only see anything otherwise in the episode 48 Hours, which I'll get back to later. This is also the episode that introduces Frank O'Sullivan, the season antagonist who represents those whose job it is to protect police from facing consequences. He seems so wrapped up in red tape and his own job that his logic runs counter to itself, and he has a blind love of the NYPD and has a really strong way of making a point, if a bit of a villainous caricature at times.
O'Sullivan wouldn't let me leave until he had explained to me why reverse racism was worse than, as he called it, classic racism.
He stands cross-armed in front of the house Rosa and Jake are trying to get into, blindly defending, ignoring the reality of the victim's bruises and the unjust use of force, and instead focus on the broken finger of one of the cops. While this is seen as ignorant, we see the nuance of this feeling of his in Jake, who believes Rosa thinks of him as a bad person now, and she tells him the reason they don't talk anymore is because he gets so defensive, and honestly, Jake's feelings are perfectly understandable. The whole show he's spent idolizing the bad boy cops of TV and film, as well as pursuing the righteous good path always and still trying to fight corruption on the inside, and with mounting criticism against all cops to completely disband irregardless of how they feel about the system they're in as opposed to work on their issues. It's a very human response to act this way, and I really appreciate the complexity that was presented here concerning the issue, and I think the most pertinent line, and honestly one that I believe is so relevant to how certain people acted during the lockdown, was, "This isn't about you.
This isn't about you. Nexus. Because the world doesn't revolve around you.
And coincidentally, the final element this episode touches on is about how bad behavior can't be punished because it goes through several people corruptly adjusting things until the police officer gets off with no consequence. We hear Captain Lamazar describe the process and brings up how several institutions, from police unions to prosecutors, play a key role in this injustice that leads to mistrust in police, which just makes the problems worse, because mistrust will lead to further escalation, while people who can try to make small changes, or at least the best they can do, like Lamazar, end up blackballed because the system went against them. The episode then ends on a somber note in silence as Jake sticks by his decision to go about attempting to change the police from the inside. Week 2.
But some jobs can't have bad apples. Okay? Some jobs, everybody gotta be good. Like pilots.
Week 2 had an episode focusing on one of the strongest elements the show has to offer, and that is another interesting angle on the relationship between this king and this queen. And by that I mean Johnny and Dora. I mean Jake and Amy. And while the reform pitch plays a role, it's mostly in facilitating another classic Brooklyn Nine-Nine story on the difficulties that come with bureaucracy. But the serious episode this week follows the role PR plays in controlling the narrative and how blackmail and union-led action blocks the progress of justice, but has a very interesting twist on how it addresses police reform. In this episode, we get a peek into police response to the public scrutiny and the realities of policing in terms of effectiveness. The episode begins with a news story about a dead rat being found in a burrito served to a police officer and about how it's been considered an act of violence against the police. While there has been precedent of people in the service industry disrespecting cops, from pig being written on Starbucks orders, bidding in food or drinks, people refusing to work or serve police officers, or asking them to leave, a lot of those original stories are what's reported on, and the reality of a human response to criticism is often not seen a lot of. I had to really dig deep to find some examples outside of ones I'd already heard of. Captain Holt references the fact that there was no proof the victim was a cop, and so he wasn't targeted for being a police officer, which is akin to a story last year of a tampon, which was later found to be a cleaning cloth, ending up in a cop's cup of coffee, and the story being that the employee knew he was a cop because of the features on his credit card, or to a Kansas police officer who said a McDonald's employee had written "f***ing pig" on his coffee cup, and then resigned after revealing that he faked it and it was all a joke, bro. I know, it's real weird how coffee-centric all of this is, but bear with me. Or how about Stacey Talbot, who caused controversy during the protest by publicly voicing her concern that something might be happening to her food while it's taking a while to come out due to public outcry, which is a fair concern, but it instead prompted those already on her side to assume something had actually been done to her food, and further prompting a discussion as to whether someone who's crying over a hypothetically poisoned McMuffin should be policing the community with a gun. In recent years, we've seen high-profile examples of hate crimes and even abuse being faked, from Jussie Smollett to Amber Heard, because any popular movement or political ideology invites people trying to get some traction off it or undermine it. And it's a difficult concept to study given its nebulous nature, with political scientists like William Riley estimating around 15% of reported hate crimes are falsified, and some others like Brian Levin putting that number at under 1%. And with the world changing and making evidence easier to fake, while at the same time easier to fact check, an eye for facts and reality with an air of scrutiny is tantamount. And we get that from Captain Holt before the opening, with a questioning angle he's previously praised in Jake after leaving prison and questioning his choices in the season 5 episode Kicks. And while this episode's plot was likely based around this entire hate crime hoax phenomenon, one story stands out as a solid inspiration behind this story. In June last year, amid anti-police sentiment on the rise, 3 NYPD police officers had gone to hospital, allegedly feeling sick after drinking milkshakes with bleach in them at a local Shake Shack. Police unions got involved. The orders were revealed to have been made from a mobile app, which means that they weren't targeted for being police officers, and an investigation revealed that no criminality was involved, with escalation provided by a lieutenant emailing the local police union about exaggerated symptoms the officers displayed, followed up by the police union stoking public outcry with a Frank O'Sullivan-esque speech, saying, when New York City police officers cannot even take a meal without coming under attack, it is clear that the environment in which we work has deteriorated to a critical level. We cannot afford to allow a guard down for even a moment. Using a real story to back up the point being made in the episode was definitely a very strong choice, and purely on this opening, the episode had already made itself important, but this is used as a springboard to explore other ideas. We see how the uniformed officers stage a walk-up by faking illnesses as part of a union-controlled blue flu movement due to the fact they aren't allowed to strike. This episode also does an interesting thing in terms of making the A, B, and C plot all part of Holt's 3-pronged plan for tackling the rat in the burrito story, and then exploring regular character conflicts and antics within the team working together for a common goal, and finding a valid reason to reintegrate Rose into the investigation. The Prong 1 story sees a classic Jake and Boyle escapade as they use Charles' mono immunity to investigate the falsified doctor's notes, but end up discovering that he might have testicular cancer and his very real fears that he might die, leaving his family and Jake behind and not getting as much time with them as he imagined he always would. And choosing story elements in moments like this to specifically focus on the fears surrounding the ending of one of the strongest character relationships on the show, and even in the entire TV landscape, in its final season, is a really smart choice. It's eventually discovered that the results of the mono test were faked by a lab owned by a relative of a 9/9 officer. I'll get more into police relatives in the week 3 section. The Prong 2 story explores Amy and Terry managing the precinct without uniformed officers, while exploring Terry's insecurities about not being perceived as tough and the pretty fun concept of the Hitchcock and Scullys of other precincts. We see how Amy has to come up with new ways to fill the role the uniformed officers left, bringing in the previously scorned night shift detectives and revealing that any attempt to get other precincts' uniformed officers involved will probably lead to a walkout from them as well. So with the detective she's been given, she has to figure out how to motivate them to walk their beat. Meanwhile, this becomes a 4th prong when Terry uses his sickness to try to record a union meeting but fails spectacularly, with a fun little bit of subversion of typical sitcom tropes right before it.
Jeffords is recording the officers' secret meeting as we speak, and I expect he'll he'll be bursting into my office any minute with the proof we need to end the blue flu.
I got the proof we need to end the blue flu.
Wait, really?
Why so surprised? That was the plan.
Yes, but earlier I was talking to the squad and I put a lot of pressure on this moment, which I then regretted. I feared I might be hoisting my own petard.
And then making the cops actually sick. The Prong 3 story sees Rosa and Holt team up to investigate as to whether the incident was faked entirely, instigating a classic Brooklyn Nine-Nine style bit about Rosa wanting to find out what Holt's tattoo is off. Of course, it's discovered the mouse was bought by the officer beforehand, but this doesn't matter because O'Sullivan, much like the brand of cops he represents, denies and escalates situations, even getting under the skin of Captain Holt and bringing out a side of him we haven't seen, which is interesting considering at this point the humor and appeal of the character comes from how often he breaks away from that season 1 presumption of him. This all culminates in a confrontation between Holt and O'Sullivan, the 5th prong, in which O'Sullivan believes he holds all the cards by telling Holt that their comp stat numbers are terrible and their arrests are down. Holt then proceeds to reveal that those cards don't mean anything, given the fact that because there were less officers trying to hit department mandated numbers, there were fewer bad arrests. Citizens complain less because cops weren't trying to find crime when there wasn't any, and evidence was correctly compiled to a sufficient standard, making it so cops weren't simultaneously part of the problem in making the community less safe while trying to make it safer. Major and violent crime numbers stay the same. So Holt reveals that either outcome works for many, puts the onus on O'Sullivan to make a choice, striking into the heart of the biggest issue surrounding issues of bad policing, which is that of sloppy, dangerous work done by officers to fulfill higher level deadlines and mandates. Looking back on this episode to write this is one of the most structurally strong and relevant of the issue tackling episodes this season, albeit not the funniest, especially after the kind of weak start. Also, I like how they had current relevance in other ways, like the Snyder Cut reference, but I digress, because if there's one thing this increasingly elongating video needs, it's digression. Week 3.
Come on, Terry, we were in a video essay. He's guns to quote the 1994 Mueller Police Corruption Commission report.
Yeah, I'm gunsta, Terry. Quit being such a mouthful.
Now, no season of Brooklyn Nine-Nine is complete without the Pontiac Bandit episodes, which explore a very interesting topic of a cop that naturally clicks with his criminal nemesis. This week, the fun classic episode is tinges of what's to come in the serious episode, with Jake in his normal strict adhering to the law being slightly bent when it comes to getting Judy off, sashaying perfectly into an episode addressing Jake's mistakes in his work, a sort of continuation of episodes like 48 Hours and Kicks. Continuing after the strong lead from week 2, this episode sees Jake working outside of his jurisdiction to uncover the true plan of a bomber, while O'Sullivan tries to skewer Amy's police accountability pilot program. Also, this episode is Boyle and Terry, competing for who can be the biggest
common candy hoe.
One very understated element of the episode is that of the running gag that Officer Marzipan, who Jake gets assistance from and is pretending to be friends with to flex on a federal agent, is increasingly revealed to be a bad guy that the NYPD is desperately trying to fire and is under multiple internal affairs investigations. This is particularly interesting given how inconsequential this guy is and how it's still an uphill battle to get him removed. Once Jake gets to the parking lot where he suspects the bomber will return to, he sees a man he suspects to be said bomber, and upon identifying himself as NYPD, a foot chase begins, which we know is a writer's shorthand for implied guilt from our experience with the show and larger police-based entertainment. But in an interesting twist, the actual bomber is caught, and Jake and the department get sued for wrongful arrest when the victim gets fired after missing work due to being detained for 10 hours, leading to a suspension and O'Sullivan coming in to protect Jake due to his connection to union member Marzipan, who is hilariously revealed to have changed his name to David Duke Marzipan. The victim in this story raises another big issue that was briefly touched on in the first episode, which is the symbiotic relationship between cop and civilian, one where communities become more dangerous because blatant power-mongering and forced escalation leads to a fear of police presence, which then leads to police's jobs being even more difficult, which then leads to even more fear. Jake, in typical Brooklyn Nine-Nine fashion that usually works out for him, suspects his suspension as being emblematic of a larger setup by O'Sullivan, who has been trying to blackmail the LGBTQ members of the Nine-Nine in a pretty dated plan that shows how connected to the old guard of policing he is. Amy and Rosa decide to investigate O'Sullivan by using his female face blindness and his blowhard attitude to get him to drunkenly admit to setting up Jake. But this unfortunately leads to O'Sullivan being completely cogent while Amy and Rosa end up smashed.
Hammered.
Well, I'm Australian, so smashed. This is when the big twist element of the episode is revealed. O'Sullivan's threat wasn't about setting up Jake, it was about taking the 9-9 snacks, tying in very well with the B plot. This is when O'Sullivan says something very interesting.
If I'm passionate about one thing, it's getting cops off without punishment. How dare you turn that into something dirty? Shame on the both of you.
This rings somewhat true with actual police unions, as in my research for this, I discovered about what are effectively get-out-of-jail-free cards police unions give out to cops and friends and family of cops to help them get out of minor infractions. While not necessarily working all the time, and whether the charge is up to the arresting officer's discretion, the implied connection and idea of making trouble for that officer is a dangerous one. And while unions are cutting down on giving these out due to the obvious corruption they breed, the fact they exist is part of a larger problem concerning police unions forming an insular community that served its own interests because of a growing divide between cop and civilian. The way this episode ends is very interesting. O'Sullivan comes in so embedded in the immunity of the system that he introduces a city attorney as being in charge of payoffs and bribes, and claims the department will settle without admitting wrongdoing, and Jake and David Duke won't face suspension suspension. This is when Holt gets huffy and comes at O'Sullivan with a speech striking at the heart of the issues in the police department, which is that of public relations and the treatment of cops as a higher class of citizen, which leads to a worse situation for the entire community because citizens will face a problem and will be too scared to call people that have been specifically trained to deal with said problem, and they won't assist or testify. This is a very cogent point because it hits a truth of policing, which is that it's a mutual collaboration between officers and civilians. People not being held to a standard they enforce, sometimes violently and even fatally, makes those laws mean nothing and turns police into civilian boogeymen. This speech works because it reveals just how self-defeating police protection is in its attempt to maintain power and keep cops safe. But what brings this scene home is when Jake takes a page out of his victim's book. When the laws and police seem unjust, the victim acted outside of his perceived best interests, and so if the system keeps being rewarded for existing, it can't change. So Jake acts outside of it and gets himself suspended to set an example. And luckily a lot of police in the real world are attempting this as well, from higher ranking officers holding their staff accountable to officers resigning. But with public perception at an all-time low, these stories of police being held accountable should be pushed to the forefront to change the perception within the police that they are exempt from consequence, and to help with public perception of police.
A lot of people don't see when police officers get fired. I know the high-profile cases, people want the people fired immediately. I want this because we're in a type of environment nowadays that it needs stuff to happen now, regardless of what any type of investigation needs to happen. But we get in trouble all the time. Police officers get fired all the time. We are held to a high standard. It's just people don't see it.
I know this is a deviation in an already much longer than I expected video, but I'm a comic guy, and this sort of action reminds me of a much smaller scale incident that happened in the comic industry decades ago. In 1954, due to concerns about mature content in comics, a Comics Code Authority was formed which would put its seal on comics that fit its rigid guidelines, which included things like crimes being committed in the story. This is what briefly led to the Joker being more of a prankster as opposed to a straight up murderer, and a storyline about a superhero sidekick developing a heroin addiction in an anti-drug PSA being shelved for a little bit, whereby an attempt to protect the public ended up removing any social weight from comics, because the seal was a way to protect from the criticism they had previously faced, but was also restricting them. Famously, in 1971 though, Marvel released an issue of Amazing Spider-Man surrounding issues related to drugs, and instead they just didn't put the seal on the comic, and relied purely on the power of the comic on its own, and showing they were able to accept the consequences to create some social discussion and change. The code was soon rewritten, and by this point in time has been completely abandoned by all publishers. This real-life precedent, among I'm sure a multitude of other examples, from women's right to vote to slavery, proved that when those protected by or benefiting from a system that oppresses others can act outside of these systems, things can change. And honestly, that sacrifice is commendable, and in my opinion, owning that mistake and accepting the consequences can sometimes require even more bravery than some of what those cops get medals for. Week 4. Week 4 goes all in on one of the weirder aspects of the show, which is that of the Boyle family, framing itself as a Knives Out-esque whodunit that it definitely works as a solid episode, but a lot of the Brooklyn Nine-Nine aspects also leak over into the issue tackling episode. This episode puts the issues a bit on the back burner to facilitate its wedding episode trappings, which we're all very familiar with, because Brooklyn Nine-Nine loves a wedding, but also to tie up season storylines and sashay into the finale. While 2 weeks ago we saw a tribute to the friendship of Charles and Jake, this week we see how Amy and Holt's mentor-mentee relationship has grown, which is poignant for this episode given we see Holt's original breakup of his marriage earlier in the season through a scene about how Amy knows him so well. We also see a return to a classic season 2 cutaway gag, the radio interference gag, the running gag of the Amy Dork dance, a Lieutenant Peanut Butter reference, and a recurrence of Smooth Holt and the iconic joke, both of which are instigated by Rosa in episodes concerning Holt's relationship, funnily enough, so it really does a little tour of the classics to prepare for the finale. But here we also see the Union and Frank O'Sullivan return, trying to skewer Holt and Amy's initiative before it has a chance to get off the ground, by using his power to change numbers inputted into the system. Through a classic escapade, they managed to get the reform proposal going citywide, but O'Sullivan ends up being elected as head of the Patrolmen's Union for life. While nothing much of note happens in terms of tackling issues compared to the prior 3 episodes, it's pretty interesting how they integrated the plot into what was clearly in episode 2 important to rewrite fully. But it leaves with a message to sum up the thesis of what it's been trying to say this season, which is that the system they operate under has issues that need fixing. Some are resistant to change, but if they don't, they'll be lost for good. But they stay hopeful, with that classic optimism Michael Shaw and his shows are known for. Week 5. In this final week, we didn't get any police reform stuff, but we got a solid finale that I'd love to talk about in another video. But I left the section here, because honestly, I started writing this in week 4, and I don't know why I thought the final week would follow the same structure. But hey, that's on me. Week 1 touched on how systems within the police protect those that commit crimes or do their jobs badly from consequence. Week 2 addressed fake news, police and union response to public outcry, and how a strive for hitting numbers makes the community less safe, while imagining a world in which those mandates are removed and there are fewer bad arrests. Week 3 showed how easy and out of their control it is for cops to get let off without consequence, and how bad apples that spoil a bunch should be ousted by removing or ignoring the systems that protect them. And week 4 summed that all up with the message for the future. This to me gets at the heart of the debate about police reform. I have no love for the O'Sullivans of the world who put their heads in the ground and defend cops no matter what. And I feel the exact same about those in the ACAB crowd who want to remove police entirely without thinking about what actually needs to change and working to do so. This is why this season works. It understands the nuances of the issue and doesn't completely jump the shark by turning on its characters and what they represent. And it doesn't stick its foot in the ground trying to mindlessly defend an institution the cast and crew probably feel heavily connected to after 7 seasons on the show. It's willing to show mistakes in even our main characters, and this is one of the most mature takes I've seen. All in all, I think this final season provided the perfect ending to its characters and ideas and managed to stay funny while still tackling relevant and serious topics. So what do you think of the final season? I'm sure there'll be some very polarizing opinions on it, and all of those are very welcome in the comment section if this gets people over here. So if you liked what you saw, like the video and subscribe. I've been Shannon McShuttle. This is the Shannon McShuttle channel because I'm a raging narcissist, and I'll see you all soon. Now I'm gonna go watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine because recording this got me in the mood. Bye.